Good evening. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh and welcome to News in Focus. My name is Faraz Patel. I would like to thank you, the viewer, for staying with us here on Hilaal TV, DSTV channel 347. Later on, I'm going to be speaking to Professor John Stremlau on President Ramaphosa's pending trip to Washington. And then after that, I'll be speaking to Ali Kumape from Africa for Palestine on the 5 arrests that had happened over last weekend at Loftus Versfeld Stadium. But let me start off with this. And the ANC wants Parliament to investigate a trip by the DAPA and the ACDP members of Parliament on a so-called fact-finding mission to Israel last month. The party has denounced the trip, saying it was not sanctioned by the Department of International Relations or even Parliament. Now, a group of at least 10 MPs travelled to the country last month on the invitation of the South African Friends of Israel, which included a meeting with Israeli President Isaac Herzog. Joining me now, I'd like to welcome ANC MP Fasiha Hassan. Fasiha, assalamu alaikum and shukran so much for joining us.
Wa alaikum salam. Thanks for having me.
Fasiha, I can't help but wonder, when the trip was planned, the parties that were mentioned, and of course everyone knows of their stance when it comes to Israel, that there was only going to be one outcome, and that was them coming back and saying there's no apartheid that is happening in Israel. And that's it. They just went to Israel. It was clear, wasn't it? That was the only outcome that was going to occur.
Yeah, I mean, it's laughable. Going on a fact-finding mission when we have all of these major human rights organizations on all of our news channels, on all of our phones. We are literally like watching a broadcast of a genocide, and they go on a fact-finding mission, come back and tell us there's no apartheid. I mean, like I said, it's completely laughable, and there was always going to be one outcome. You're quite right. And that is actually why we're calling it a propaganda trip, because there was never going to be any sort of, I would say, even going over to see what's going on in the West Bank or even in Palestine, because the reality is then they'd come back with a different outcome or a different view.
This is the thing, Fasiha, right? They went to Israel. Of course you're going to get that outcome. But the fact that there's the occupied West Bank, then there's, of course, Gaza. Very difficult to go into Gaza right now, given the genocide that is happening there. But even a trip to the occupied West Bank, where there are refugee camps, where there's a massive wall, where there's human rights atrocities happening all over. I mean, every single human rights organization is stating that. And yet, it just feels that there's a blind eye that has been turned for them to go ahead and actually make the trip there to see it with their own eyes. I mean, it's quite obvious, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very intentional. And what we are also witnessing is the Zionist lobby and their, not just attempts, but their infiltration in South African politics. So they were very particular about who they chose, who they asked, and where they took everybody to. And it rings very much of what the National Party during Apartheid South Africa did. They had all these foreign delegations that would come. They would see a whites-only South Africa. They'd come back and be like, oh, there's no apartheid, things are fine, whites can vote, etc., etc. And that's why it was so important for us in Parliament to draw that parallel. Because in a country like ours, I mean, this is a playbook that Israel is taking straight out of the hands of our own oppressors, even in this country. And that's really, for me, Faraz, what's so shocking and what's so disappointing, that MPs who are very politically aware, know what happened in our country, can then go and basically be complicit and tools of propaganda for an apartheid somewhere else.
Fasiha, the MPs, some of the 10 are within the Government of National Unity, Patriotic Alliance, Democratic Alliance. What is the way forward now? I want to start off first from a parliamentary perspective. What is it that the ANC wants in terms of seeing accountability or even answering from some of these MPs?
Yeah, so on a parliamentary level, and I agree, let's start there. We have already written to the Speaker. One of the things that we want to know is whether they traveled on their official passports. So when you become an MP, you get this kind of passport. So you can only use it with permission and when you're on official business. So that's the first thing that we could potentially knock them on. But we're also looking and already in discussions with other political parties, and it's very premature for me to say it, but I'll just mention it high level. There's some discussions about a motion. There's some discussions about establishing an ad hoc committee. Ultimately, what we want to do is hold them accountable, whether it's on the ethics committee or whether it's in terms of some other punitive stuff. But we are working on something. And the other thing that's important to mention here, Faraz, is that the ANC is also going to be bringing a bill. It's called the Anti-Apartheid Bill. And it's not only about apartheid Israel, it's basically about oppression and apartheid all over the world. And basically declaring that Parliament and the space is an anti-apartheid zone. And so that's another long-term thing that we're looking at and we're already working on, such that we prevent these kinds of fact-finding missions or propaganda trips in the future. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, in terms of the government of national unity, and I'm really glad that you asked that, because that is a question on everybody's minds. So the first thing is, I mean, it's public knowledge. The budget is yet to be tabled. And one of the things that we've already started in the ANC is a re-looking at the GNU, but also a dispute resolution mechanism. So one of the things that we want is internal to the GNU to have accountability mechanisms. Within that, we'll be able to hold certain people and certain elements accountable. So there is that element, but let's be very clear and very open. The ANC is never, ever going to renegade on the Palestinian cause. We are going to see the ICJ case to its fullest conclusion, and we will always stand by the people of Palestine. So I don't want any of our viewers to be worried about that. What we are now trying to do is effectively create all of these spaces, and it must be uncomfortable for them. There's no way they can come back to our country and think that what they did is okay.
Fasiha, I'm going to go to the Department of International Relations and Cooperation. One would think that there has to be a sanctioning that comes from DIRCO itself. All three of the top officials there, where it's the minister, deputy minister, and the DG, are ANC officials. How does one now look at DIRCO and its role with regards to this? Because one would think that before these 10 MPs had travelled, there had to be some sort of communication with DIRCO, and one would imagine that Minister Ronald Lamola would say, well, I don't think this is possible given government stance, because government is, of course, its head of state, President Cyril Ramaphosa, has the stance of being pro-Palestine and this ICJ case that is still there. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so it is very clear to us that DIRCO was not aware of this trip, and that's why we're calling it an unsanctioned trip, both by Parliament and by DIRCO. And that's actually one of those mechanisms I mentioned earlier. We want to know which passports did they travel on, because even to travel on an official passport, you need a note verbal, which is basically the sort of paperwork that comes from DIRCO. So we know they didn't have permission. And you're very correct. Had they approached DIRCO or Parliament, we would have made it very clear that there is a conflict of interest. Now, why is this important? Some people are saying, oh, well, in their private capacities, they can go anywhere. But they didn't go in their private capacities, because when they came back, Friends of Israel, or whatever they call themselves, basically said, here's all these MPs that went to Israel and they say there's no apartheid. So you can't wear one cap on one day and say, oh, I'm an MP today when I come back and say there's no Israel, but actually when I went on the trip, it was in my private capacity. Because then you can't come back and tell us these things. So, you know, that's actually one of the ways we've already started. Like I said, we've already written to the speaker through the official channels, and we are waiting for feedback on that. But I think the bigger issue here, and that's why we must be very vigilant, I would say. It's not only a Zionist infiltration or a Zionist lobby group within politics. I think we're going to see a major pushback. In fact, we're already seeing a major pushback from the global Zionist lobby. And it's not only going to be around Parliament, it's going to be in every sector. And so it also falls on us as South Africans to keep an eye out, to be vigilant. When we see other trips of this nature in other sectors, come forward, let's talk about it, let's find ways to not only prevent people from going, but also, very importantly, conscientize. I think that's the big one, that it's just unacceptable behavior.
Fasiha, one final question. The ACDP, they've made their stance clear. They're in full support of Israel. Patriotic Alliance's President Gaten McKenzie, well, he's quite clear when it comes to Israel. He's even gone ahead and quoted verses of the Bible. The DA, though, it's a head-scratcher, but a lot of people would say they are in full support of Israel because its federal chairperson, Helen Zille, says, well, there should be a two-state solution, a sovereign Palestine with a safe and secure Israel. So what is the way forward with regards to these MPs and their accountability, given their respective parties' stance on Israel? Two of them, vermin supporters of Israel. The other one, well, if you're living under the rock, you'd think, well, there's a 50-50 right there. Your take on that?
don't think there'll be any accountability within their own political parties. And you've actually hit the nail on its head. One of the tactics of the Zionist lobby is also to capture parties like the Patriotic Alliance, to almost put a black or colored face to their campaign, right? So that's also very important for them. And let's also be open and honest, right? The reality is there's a lot of money moving in this. And that was one of the big questions we were also asking. Did MPs get a stipend when they went on this trip? Who funded the trip? How much did it cost? All of those things must be declared. Because, by the way, Faraz, if the tables had turned and it was the ANC, MKP, and EFF who went on whatever trip, obviously never to Israel, but whatever the case may be, they would also be demanding transparency. So you can't have your cake on one side and say, oh, we want transparency and financial accountability. And then when it's you guys, nothing actually happens. So that's also a big part of it, because that does then give us some ammunition, like I said, in terms of the ethics committee, but also in terms of declarations. So when you're a public representative, you have to declare any gift, any amount of money, any trip. And if that's not declared, that's also an opportunity for us to knock them.
Yeah, first, one final question. If it's found, I mean, you brought up an important point with regards to stipend or any financial assistance that they received without declaring it to Parliament. They are MPs, they've made an oath to the people of South Africa. What then is the way forward? Could there be arrest? Could there be some sort of further punishment should this be found?
It would definitely be further punishment. We would write to the official, there's actually what we call the integrity commissioner kind of thing in Parliament. We would write to them, they'd investigate. The first sanction is actually docking of pay. So, of course, they'll have to investigate and see the seriousness of it. And we would actually probably ask for further sanctioning. In terms of arrests, I think we need to be clear that that would have to go through the police and the National Prosecuting Authority. But there are definitely ways we can hold them accountable. And there are definitely ways in which we can make it extremely unpopular for anyone to ever think of even going on a trip like this again.
Fasiha, pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for joining us. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. Thanks for having me.
That's Fasiha Hassan, a Member of Parliament for the African National Congress. After the break, I'm going to be speaking to Professor John Stremlau. We're going to be looking ahead to President Ramaphosa's trip to Washington next week. Do stay tuned.